Deadrock, Montana, a place where even the wind howls as if it's trying to escape. The storm that night swept through the town with a cold howl. Seeping through the warped wooden walls of the Dust Lantern, the town's oldest brothel. Inside, the flickering light of kerosene lamps reflected off the dingy ceiling, where the smell of cheap liquor, stale sweat, and adulterated tobacco clung to the wood as if it had dried out a century ago. Laughter broke like crushed glass. Someone banged on the table. The piano player lost his tune. But no one cared. Everyone was drunk. Drunk on wine. Drunk on fatigue. Drunk on despair. In that atmosphere, unhappiness was not prominent. It was background. It was habit. A man, drunken, the smell of cigarettes and stale beer rising from his mouth like a poisonous gas, stood up abruptly in the far corner of the room. He slammed his glass down on the table, the liquid splashing onto the dirty tablecloth. "Where is that bitch?" he drawled, but his eyes were bloodshot. "I paid an hour ago. Don't tell me you're sick again." An old woman, so overdone with her makeup that her face looked like a wax mask, stepped forward. Geneva, the owner of the brothel. She smiled a crooked smile, like a pulled seam. "She'll be out soon. Honey, she's just getting ready." You said that last time. She's always sick and weak. Or do you want me to go get a priest to pray for her? In the darkness behind the old velvet curtains, discolored by smoke and dust, Clara stood still. One hand clutched her chest. The other clutched a bloody cloth. She had just coughed up blood. The third time that day. Dizziness made the floor tilt beneath her feet. Cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck, even as the cold air seeped through the cracks in the planks. She knew that if she didn't go out, she would be dragged away. But if she did, she might get out, or I'll drag you out by the hair. Geneva hissed, her voice hoarse as if dragging steel over a grindstone. Clara shook her head, softly, like a sleepwalker. "I can't." Her voice was a hoarse whisper. Geneva's hand slapped her face like a whip. The impact rang out sharply, and Clara fell, crouching against the edge of the dressing table, blood dripping from her mouth onto the dirty tablecloth. "What do I feed you for, if all you do is cough?" Outside, the guest smashed another glass. The piano player stopped. The chatter died. No one moved. No one helped. Only one man stood up slowly, almost silently. Eli McRae, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes like winter glaciers cold. Deep and still, the cowboy stood in the chaos, as if he had stepped out of another dream or a nightmare that had not ended. He was not from Deadrock. He had just arrived this morning. No one knew anything about him, except that his eyes had seen war and no longer believed in victory. Eli crossed the room, his eyes not on Geneva, not on the howling visitor, but on Clara, who was lying face down on the floor, her skinny arms struggling to stand. He bent down, gently, as if he did not want to break any more of her. When he stood up, Clara was in his arms, her head against his chest, her hair matted with blood. She did not speak. Neither did he. "What the hell are you doing?" Geneva screamed. Eli stood up straight. His eyes did not leave Geneva. His voice was even and low, like the sound of a knife being drawn from a sheath. "Are you going to kill her in front of everyone?" "Geneva stiffened. It's none of your business." Eli pulled out a wad of bills and threw them on the counter like trash. His tone did not change. "It's my business now. Redden, you buy it?" "No." Eli looked her straight in the eye. "I choose her." Redden. One sentence. Short, like a verdict, like a non-negotiable decision. No one dared to react. No one stopped. And so he was gone, carrying Clara to the door, opening it into the howling wind. leaving the room in silence. No one applauded. No one cheered. But no one stopped either. The door slammed behind them. The wind blew in before closing. Only the smell of blood, wine, and humiliation remained on the floor. On the horse, Eli wrapped Clara in his old blanket. She gasped. Quietly. Her breath was as thin as smoke. He heard her whisper, "Don't. Take me back there." And Eli didn't know if she heard him or not. But he said, "I'm not taking you back. I'm taking you away." And the horse walked slowly through the snow. Behind him, the light of the dust lantern slowly faded. And ahead, the snow continued to fall. But now, each flake fell not to bury her, but to start over, in the arms of a man who promised nothing but silence. Clara was no longer a commodity to be traded. She was a chosen one, and for the first time in years, she felt not like she was dying, but like she was living. The snowstorm lasted 3 days and 3 nights. The wind howled on the mountainside like a warning from the heavens that whatever took refuge here must survive on its own. But inside the little log cabin, the fire burned steadily in the hearth. Each crackle was a whisper of life. Silent, but persistent, Clara lay motionless in the single bed by the window, wrapped tightly in an old wool blanket. Her breathing was raspy, her chest constricting as she coughed. But here, no one yelled at her when she coughed. No doors slammed open. No hands slapped her face. There was only the smell of herbs and half-burnt pine, and the quiet sound of a man stirring the pot of soup. Eli did not talk much. He moved little, made no unnecessary noise. Every time Clara opened her eyes, he was sitting there, by the fireplace or by the window, holding a log and a small knife, silently whittling wood. Sometimes he would just close his eyes, his back against the wall, but he would hear her cough and rise as if he had been waiting. On Wednesday morning, Clara opened her eyes and looked out the window for the first time. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was strangely clear, and when she forced herself to sit up, despite the pain in her chest that pressed her lips together, she saw a wooden bowl by the bed. In it was potato soup, with a few dried wild herbs. The taste was simple, light, and clean. She drank it all. Eli came in, carrying a small bundle of firewood. His coat was covered with snow. Their eyes met for a brief moment. "You can sit up," he said, his voice as deep as a wooden crib. There was no praise, no pity, just confirmation. Clara nodded. The next day, she learned to walk again. Each step was like tearing at the unhealed part of her body. But Eli did not help. He just walked beside her, neither too far nor too close. When she fell to her knees, he put his hand on her back, holding her gently so she wouldn't fall. No pulling, no urging. He was just there. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd been allowed to be vulnerable without having to pay the price. She'd grown accustomed to the silence here, a kind of silence that didn't carry danger. It was like space for the wound to breathe. On the 10th day, she asked the horse's name. Eli answered, not looking up, "Mayra." "Away?" She smiled. That afternoon, they sat on the porch. She wrapped a blanket around herself, holding a cup of hot water. He fixed the sagging awning. She studied his hands. Large, calloused, but gentle, not the hands of someone who had hurt her. "How long have you lived here alone?" she asked. "A few winters." "And isn't it cold?" "Cold, but still." Clara looked out at the snow-covered valley. A breeze brushed her cheek. She shivered. "I used to be afraid of winter," she said. "I thought, if I died in winter, my body wouldn't rot as fast." Eli said nothing, but the sound of the saw stopped. "I had a husband," she continued, her voice unwavering but hollow. "David. We got married when I was 18. He worked in the mines at Elhorn. I told him it was dangerous. He laughed, said you had to live for the next meal first, and then dream about the long term. End quote. One day, he didn't come back. They said it was poison gas. Quick. Painless. As she sighed. No one asked me if I had any money. No one told me where I was going. Someone promised to help, but took me to a place where the door was locked from the outside. He didn't understand. Until I did. It was too late. End of chapter. She turned to him. Sometimes I prayed I would die. Flu. Fever. Getting beaten up by a customer. Just don't wake up. But then you showed up. A's. Eli put down the board and wiped his hands on his pants. I wanted to die for other reasons. Too, he said, his eyes never leaving the distant hills. Not because someone hurt me, but because I hurt others. End quote. I was a soldier. In the South, when I didn't know what I was fighting for. End quote. The first time I killed, I thought it was my duty. The 10th time, I felt nothing. End quote. He turned to Clara, his eyes as pale as snow. When the war was over, I was no one's son, no man of any land. I only knew that I had survived when others had not, and that was no reward. They sat in silence, only the wind. And then, she asked, why did you help me? Eli thought, I saw you, not as the sick one, but as the one no one else chose. She looked down at her hands, the thin fingers covered with dry calluses. So you chose me? I didn't think. I just couldn't turn away. She sat reading by the fire that night. An old book. The pages worn. The title faded. He sat on the wooden whistling seat opposite, glancing at it now and then. No one spoke. But Clara's eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. He did too. The next morning, Clara walked around the cabin. She opened the window to let in the cold air, washed her face with cold water, and sat in the sun. She smiled. A real smile, not forced. Eli saw it, but said nothing, just nodded, and turned away. As if not wanting to break the moment, a question arose in Clara's mind. When did peace become dangerous? She was so used to the idea that all good things ended in pain. And deep in the wind, she could hear some echo of the past. The sound of Geneva. The sound of broken glasses. The sound of money being placed on the table. Clara knew she would not let go easily. And it was as if Eli knew too. He checked the stables more carefully. More wood was chopped. Every action was prepared. But they didn't talk about it. Because if they did, it would mean it was coming. The last evening of the second week, as they sat together on the porch, Clara put down her teacup and turned to look at him. If I want to stay here longer, just to live, and not for anyone else, would you let me? Eli looked at her a long time, then said, I don't keep you, but I don't send you away. She nodded slightly. That was enough of an answer. And that night, for the first time, in a long time, Clara slept without dreams. No dreams, no nightmares. Just the wind blowing through the pines, and the silence of a man who doesn't need to say he loves you, because his presence is his confirmation. But far away, the storm was still gathering, and Geneva had not forgotten. She had never forgotten. The morning began like any other on the mountain. Clara rose early, gathering firewood, boiling water, checking the stove. Eli was outside in the stable, the sound of his axe chopping wood as steady as the heartbeat of the place. The new sunlight streaming through the window cast a pale gold over the floor, and Clara's face as she sat sewing an old shawl. Everything seemed to be at peace. But some things didn't need a sound to be announced. They came silently, like shadows creeping across the snow. Eli had just finished stacking the firewood when he stopped. He raised his head, Not because of the sound, but because of the silence, the kind of silence he had learned to recognize on the battlefield, where the birds stopped singing, always signaling bloodshed. His hand gripped the handle of his axe tighter than usual. His eyes scanned the woods across the street, and he saw it. Boot prints. Fresh. Sunk deep into the snow next to the fence. Not his. Not Clara's. He walked straight into the cabin. His face was as tight as a bowstring, but his voice was calm. "Don't go out," he said to Clara. She raised her head, a little frightened. "A wolf?" Ellie didn't answer. He just bent down, opened the drawer next to the fireplace, and took out the rifle he hadn't used in a long time. He wiped the dust off, opened the box, took out each bullet, and carved it with his small knife. No words, no pictures, just a scratch. Like the old habit of a soldier who counted his life by each shot. Clara looked at him, speechless. "You swore never to use a gun again," she said softly. "Yes," Eli answered, not looking up. But that oath wasn't for the kind of people who were coming. End of 2. In the woods, Luther Cobb was walking slowly through the trees. His eyes narrowed like a hunting wolf. He had been following the trail for 3 days. Through the snow, through the campfire, through the bloody rags he'd picked up on the stream bank. And now, in front of him, was the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney. Steady and clear. No alarm. Good. He wrapped the rope around his waist, his hand brushing the gun but not drawing it. He preferred his hand. Quieter. Cleaner. He didn't knock. Just push it opened. Askia das a breath. Clara whirled around. But before she could scream, a hand covered her mouth. The grip wasn't too strong, but it was enough to silence her. Not loud. "Little girl," Luther whispered. "I don't want to hurt you, unless you force me to." "Oh." He pulled her to her feet, quickly tying her hands together with the rope he'd prepared. Clara struggled, but her body was still weak, and he was used to controlling prey. "There's a bounty on you. You know?" He whispered in her ear. $50 for a sick girl. You're worth more than any horse I've ever sold. Olé." The door swung open. Cold air rushed in, and Eli stood there, gun in hand. His eyes no longer soft as they had been in days. There was only deadly silence. "Let her go," Eli said, his voice low and even, but clear in every word. Luther turned, pulling Clara into his shield. "Oh, you. I thought the old boss was back for wood." "Of last time. Let her go." "Of." Luther smiled, but his eyes never left the barrel of the gun. "What are you going to do? Shoot me? I heard you dropped your gun. Maybe you were afraid of your own hand." And Clara struggled. "Eli," she cried, "remember why you saved me." And Eli's grip tightened. His eyes shook. In that moment, memories flooded back the mud of the battlefield. The whistling of bullets. The eyes of 16-year-old boys falling without even calling their mothers' names. The bullets, he had taken each one a life. Each one a curse. He had sworn never to kill again. Never to let blood stain his hands again. But now, blood was on his hands. Not someone else's. But Clara's. If he didn't shoot, he would take her away, to a place where the doors were locked from the outside, where no name was needed. Just a body. Eli exhaled. His eyes never left Luther. His hands stopped shaking. He had chosen. Again. He raised the gun. Straight. Slowly. The gunshot rang out in a single beat. Luther paused, his eyes wide with disbelief. A red dot spread across his chest. It looked down, then collapsed. No scream, no final words. Just a crash against the wooden floor, like so many he had taken out before. But this time, it wasn't a battlefield. Not for a flag, not for an order, just for a woman crying. Clara collapsed beside him. Her hands were still tied, her lips bleeding from the bites she'd suffered as she resisted. Eli stepped forward, untying the ropes. But when his hands touched hers, his whole body shook. He fell to his knees. The gun fell from his hands, sliding across the floor. Wind whistled through the open door. He bowed his head, his whole body curling up, not from fear, not from guilt, but from every memory, every old wound that flared up at once, tearing apart the peace he'd tried to maintain for so many years. Eli, Clara whispered, holding his head, her hands shaking. You saved me, not with a bullet, by not turning away. He said nothing, just let himself be held in her frail arms. He didn't know he was crying, but tears silently soaked into her sleeve. In the cabin, the fire was still burning. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and between two broken hearts, the only thing left was each other's breathing, the only thing real enough to keep them from falling again. Eli had killed, but this time, it was to save a part of himself. And Clara, for the first time, was no longer the one being saved, but the one holding someone back from the darkness. A life lost, but two souls alive again. Spring came slowly on the mountaintop, as if it took time for it to believe that winter was really over. The snow melted, revealing a damp earth that smelled of sap and rotting leaves. In the soft early morning sunlight, tiny green shoots pushed through the hard soil, trembling and determined. Just as Clara stepped out onto the porch each morning with her hands still weak, but her eyes daring to look straight ahead, the cabin was more than a shelter now. It was home. Clara hung towels on the porch, cooked soup without prompting, and opened the windows every morning to let the light in. She planted clumps of wildflowers on the windowsill, names unknown, simply because their color reminded her of warmth. Eli repaired the porch, replaced the old hinges, and every night silently added more wood to the fireplace, even when it was already warm enough. No one would call it love, but that was how they loved. One afternoon, Clara sat down to write. The paper was old. The ink was black, her hand still trembling slightly. She wrote slowly, not because she was tired, but because each word was addressed to an older version of herself, to the girl who believed she was trash. She doesn't know this, but someday, someone will see her not as a stain, but as a wildflower that survived the frost. Someone will choose to stay. When everyone else has left, she is not broken. She is just a soul that needs to be heard. And she deserves a love that begins not with pity, but with respect. She doesn't have to survive to please anyone. She survives because her heart still beats. And that is enough. She folded the letter, placing it under the floorboards beside her bed, where no one needs to find it. Just know it's there. A testament that she has weathered the storm and is still alive. That night, Eli led her to the back of the cabin. On the grass that was just starting to grow green, he placed a simple ring on her finger. Raw metal. No shine. No gems. But in his eyes, it sparkled more than anything she had ever seen. He had forged it, he said, from an old coin. One he had carried with him all the way from the battlefield. Not to spend, not to remember, but to wait for something worthy. Clara looked at him. There were no tears, just a deep peace. She nodded. When they said their vows, there was no cathedral, no witnesses but the wind, the trees, and the changing sky. But they knew the sacredness was not in the ritual. It was in the fact that after all the heartbreak, they could still put their trust in another person's hand and call it home. If you've ever been broken, if you've ever thought no one would ever touch your scars, if you've ever been afraid of the look in the mirror, this story is for you. Like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Because we don't tell perfect love stories, we tell stories of hearts that have been broken, but still beat. And as Clara and Eli have proven, if only someone stays, every wound can become a part of something beautiful.